Damn it. Why won't this thing start? Henry's voice echoed through the cavernous room, bouncing off the cold steel walls of the ancient ink machine. The room was bathed in a sickly green light that flickered from the broken bulbs overhead, casting eerie shadows on the floor. He kicked the rusted contraption in frustration, sending a shower of dust and flakes of paint flying into the stagnant air. The workshop around him looked like it hadn't seen a soul in decades. Tools lay scattered haphazardly on the floor, their metal surfaces coated with a thick film of dust. Shells groaned under the weight of forgotten sketchbooks and half-used paint tubes, and a thick layer of grime obscured the glass panes of the windows, blocking out any hint of the outside world. Henry's heart raced as he tried to piece together the last moments before he blacked out. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water that seemed to come from every direction at once. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the metallic scent of the room that made his nose twitch. His hand brushed against something sticky and wet on the floor. He jerked away, his eyes widening in horror as he realized what it was. Ink, thick, black, and alive. It pooled around his feet like a living shadow, reaching out to him with a sinister intent. As he took a tentative step back, the ink rippled and a face formed in the fluid. "Welcome, Henry," it said in a guttural growl. "You're just in time for the show." The face morphed into a twisted grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The ink began to pulse and swirl, rising up into a monstrous form. It was the ink demon, a creature of nightmares made flesh. "You've been looking for a way out, haven't you?" it taunted. "But the only way to leave this place is through me." The creature's laughter echoed through the studio, sending a shiver down Henry's spine. He looked around for a weapon, his eyes landing on a discarded wrench. He grabbed it, feeling the cold steel in his grip, and stepped forward to face the demon. The ink demon loomed over him, a towering mass of writhing tendrils and malicious eyes that darted around the room. "Ye think you can fight me with that?" it jeered. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the room burst open, and a group of ragged individuals stumbled in. They were the believers, survivors like him, who had managed to avoid the demon's grasp. Their eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a spark of determination in their gazes. One of them, a young woman with a scarf tied around her head, stepped forward. "We know what you're planning, Henry," she said urgently, "but you can't fight it alone. We need to stick together." The ink demon's laugh grew louder, the ink bubbling and churning as it grew more agitated.
"You think your little band of misfits can stop me?"
It lunged at them, tendrils snaking through the air. The believers moved as one, each of them brandishing their makeshift weapons, pens, paintbrushes, and shards of glass. Henry stepped back, letting the group form a protective barricade around him. He had to admit, they had a plan, a shaky one, but it was better than nothing. "We know the demon's weakness," the scarfed woman whispered to him. "The light from the machine. If we can get it to activate, we might have a chance." The group exchanged nods, their eyes shifting to the towering ink machine in the center of the room. The lights around it flickered ominously. They had a plan. Now they just had to execute it without getting consumed by the living nightmare before them. The air grew thick with tension as the battle between hope and darkness began to unfold in the haunted studio. "Quick, To the control panel, Henry barked, pointing at a dusty console next to the ink machine. The believers sprang into action, each one with a clear role to play. The scarfed woman, who introduced herself as Lila, took the lead, her nimble fingers dancing across the ancient switches and dials. The others spread out, ready to distract the demon with their makeshift arsenal of art supplies. As Lila worked, the demon's tendrils shot out like lightning, narrowly missing the survivors. The room was alive with the sound of scraping metal and splattering ink. One of the believers, a burly man with a paint-splattered apron, hurled a jar of paint at the demon. It exploded on impact, sending a burst of colorful liquid into the creature's eyes. It recoiled, roaring in anger and pain. Seizing the moment, Lila hit a switch, and the ink machine roared to life, the lights around it brightening with a pulse. The demon screeched, its form recoiling from the sudden burst of light. "Now, Henry, now," she called out. Gripping the wrench tightly, Henry took a deep breath and stepped forward, aiming for the glowing core of the demon. With all his strength, he swung at the beast, the metal clanging against the demon's thick, inky skin. The demon's roars grew more desperate as the light from the machine grew brighter. The ink began to boil and retreat, the creature shrinking before their eyes. The believers pressed their advantage, striking from all angles. The demon thrashed, trying to escape the searing light, but it was too late. With a final agonized shriek, it dissolved into a pool of thick black ink. For a moment, the room was still. The only sound was the hiss of the cooling machine and the labored breathing of the survivors. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered back to life, the shadows retreating. The puddles of ink grew brighter, and Henry felt a strange warmth spread through his body. He looked down to see his own shadow begin to shift and writhe, the ink rising to form the face of the demon again. "You think you've won," it rasped, a hint of fear in its voice. "This is only the beginning." The survivors stared in horror as the demon's shadow grew larger, reaching out to engulf them. Before it could touch them, however, the lights in the room blazed with a brilliant white, and the demon's form dissipated with a scream. The room was bathed in a purifying light that seemed to cleanse the very air of the malevolence that had hung over it. "What's happening?" someone murmured. And Lila's eyes gleamed with understanding. "The machine," she said, her voice filled with awe. "It's not just a weapon. It's a doorway to another place, another time." The light grew stronger, and the ink began to swirl around the edges of the room, forming a vortex. The survivors looked at each other, unsure whether to flee or embrace the unknown. "This is our chance," Henry said, his voice firm. "We can't let the demon win. We have to go through." Without another word, the group stepped into the light, the whirlwind of ink swirling around them. The world outside the studio grew hazy, and the air grew thick with the scent of possibility. As they were drawn into the vortex, they could feel the fabric of reality stretching and bending. Their destination was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their journey through the dark puddles was far from over. As the ink swirled around them, the survivors tightened their grip on each other. Their eyes squeezed shut against the blinding light. The sensation of falling washed over Henry, his stomach lurching as the ground beneath his feet disappeared. The wind roared in his ears, and he could feel the warmth of the others' bodies next to his, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. With a sudden jolt, they landed. The light dimmed, and Henry blinked, his eyes adjusting to the new scene. They had arrived in a vast library, the shelves stretching up into the darkness like the branches of an ancient tree. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and the faint hint of something else. Thea. The walls were lined with paintings, their subjects contorting and reaching out as if trapped within the frames, begging for release. The ink demon's shadowy form began to coalesce in the center of the room. "You cannot escape me," it snarled, its eyes burning with a malevolent glow. The floor trembled with its fury. But the believers had come prepared. One of them, a young man with spectacles, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He began to read from it, his voice steady and clear. The demon's eyes narrowed, and its form began to waver as the words took hold. It was an incantation, an ancient spell to banish the creature back to the realm from which it had come. The others joined in, their voices rising in a cacophony of defiance. The ink on the floor grew agitated, forming a whirlpool around the demon. It fought against the power of the words, its tendrils thrashing and trying to grab hold of the survivors. Henry could feel the pull of the ink, the darkness tugging at his soul, trying to claim him. He gritted his teeth and focused on Lila, her scarf fluttering in the chaotic breeze of the demon's fury. Her eyes met his, and she nodded, a silent message of trust. Together, they pushed forward, their shadows joining the battle. The incantation grew louder, the ink rising higher. The demon roared in protest, but the light from the pages grew brighter, and its hold grew weaker. With a final, desperate howl, the demon was sucked into the whirlpool, disappearing into the depths of the ink. The room grew still once more, the air heavy with the silence of victory and the unspoken dread of what might come next. The survivors looked around, panting and disheveled, the reality of their situation sinking in. They had escaped the studio, but at what cost? A library around them whispered secrets of a world much larger and more terrifying than the one they had left behind. "We need to keep moving," Lila said, her voice echoing through the vast room. "The demon won't be gone for long. We need to find a way to end this for good." They nodded in agreement, steeling themselves for the challenges ahead. They had stepped from the frying pan into the fire, but they were not going to let the ink demon dictate their fate. As they ventured deeper into the labyrinthine library, the pages of the books fluttered, as if beckoning them onward. Henry couldn't help but wonder if his lost memories were somewhere within the endless tomes, waiting to be found. The adventure had just begun, and the nightmares were far from over. But with the believers by his side, he felt a flicker of hope, a beacon in the dark sea of fear that surrounded them. Their footsteps echoed through the hallowed halls, the only sound in the deafening silence. They moved with purpose, each step carrying them further from the demon's clutches and closer to the truth of Henry's past. The darkness grew thicker, the air colder, but they pushed onward, driven by the need to survive. Their path led them to a massive, ornate door, its surface etched with arcane symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly power. It was the door to the demon's lair, the source of its power. The survivors looked at each other, and Henry knew what they were all thinking. This was it. The moment they had all been dreading yet preparing for since they had first set foot in the studio. He stepped forward, his hand on the handle. It was cold to the touch, like the hand of death itself. He took a deep breath and pushed, the heavy wood groaning as it swung open. Beyond lay a chamber that defied description, a place where ink had been brought to life, creating a twisted landscape of shadow and dread. The air was thick with the scent of corruption, and the walls pulsed with the dark heartbeat of the demon's essence. The ink demon waited for them, its form now a grotesque amalgamation of their deepest fears and darkest faults. It loomed over them, a monstrous silhouette against the flickering lights of the room. "You dare to challenge me in my own domain," it bellowed, its voice a symphony of tormented screams. The believers didn't waver. They had faced the demon before and knew that fear was its most potent weapon. They spread out, each one standing firm, ready to fight for their survival. Lila stepped to Henry's side, the paper with the incantation clutched in her hand. "We're ready," she murmured, and he nodded, feeling the warmth of camaraderie and shared determination. They began to recite the spell once more, their voices echoing through the chamber, growing stronger with each syllable. The demon recoiled, its shadowy form writhing in agony as the ancient words stripped away its power. The ink on the floor grew restless, rising in a defensive wave around its master. But the survivors were relentless. They had tasted victory once and knew it was within their grasp. Henry felt his own anger and fear coalesce into a weapon, his shadow joining the fray, a sword of pure light that cleaved through the demon's inky tendrils. The demon's eyes grew wide with terror as it realized the depth of their resolve. It roared and lashed out, but the survivors were a well-oiled machine, each one knowing exactly what to do. They had become more than just a group of individuals. They were a force of light in the face of the abyss. As the incantation reached its crescendo, the demon was forced back, its form weakening with every word. The ink retreated, revealing the true face of the creature, a twisted mockery of humanity, a being that had been corrupted by its own power. And then, with a final burst of light, the demon was no more. The ink dissipated, leaving behind a feeling of emptiness and relief so profound that it brought tears to Henry's eyes. The survivors looked at each other, their expressions a mix of disbelief and triumph. They had done it. They had defeated the ink demon. But as they turned to leave the chamber, the floor gave way beneath them. The world spun, and suddenly they were falling into the abyss that had been the demon's heart. The darkness closed in, and for a moment, Henry thought that this was the end, that they had only traded one nightmare for another. Yet, as they fell, the pages of the books around them fluttered and reached out, wrapping them in a soft embrace. The pages grew warm and the light grew brighter, lifting them up and carrying them through the void. When they opened their eyes again, they found themselves in a world bathed in the soft glow of dawn, the ink stains on their clothes the only evidence of the horrors they had faced. They had won, but their journey was far from over. The library had been a prison for the demon, and now that it was gone, they had to face the reality of what lay beyond. A world forever changed by the creature's influence. a world that would need their help to heal. They stood there, at the precipice of a new chapter in their lives, the sunrise painting the sky with hues of hope. The dark puddles had been a part of them, but now it was time to leave it behind. They had a world to save, a story to rewrite, and Henry knew that together they could conquer any nightmare that lay ahead.